What we need today is not just bottom-up resistance. We also need a new elite, not of birth, wealth, or silly credentials, but of massive positive impact. I'm talking about a skin in the game elite, about people who use what they have, their human, financial, or cultural capital, to make a huge difference. Our goal should be to make future historians proud. This is not about left versus right. It's about seriousness versus laziness, determination versus apathy, good versus evil. Hello, my name is Rutger Bregman, and in my second BBC Reith lecture called How to Start a Moral Revolution, I look back at the movement to abolish slavery in the British Empire. I'll be asking what lessons we can learn from the abolitionists and how we can make leading good and virtuous lives fashionable again. In the autumn of 1917, the mood on the streets of Petrograd wasn't one of revolutionary zeal. It was exhaustion, cynicism, apathy. After years of hunger, war, and hopelessness, most Russians had given up on politics altogether. They hated the Tsar and the royal family, but also the incompetent liberals who replaced them. They hated the corrupt officials, the generals, the landlords, the priests. Everyone was part of the same broken system. So when Lenin and his Bolsheviks marched on the Winter Palace, many Russians shrugged. Fine, take it. You won't last 6 weeks either. But the Bolsheviks did last. Not 6 weeks, 70 years. The Russian Revolution is a textbook case of how apathy paves the way for tyranny. When the center collapses, when no one believes in anything anymore, when the old world is so discredited that even madmen look like a better option, that's when history takes a darker turn. In my first Reith lecture, I argued that we're living through a similar moment of unraveling. I described how immorality and unseriousness have become the two defining traits of today's elites. I likened America to the spectacular collapse of Rome and Europe to the slow death of Venice. Across the West, trust in democracy is declining. People are tuning out, swiping away, switching off. They don't believe in politicians, in the media, in courts or elections. They've seen too much hypocrisy, too many broken promises. This is a moment of extraordinary opportunity for modern-day Lenins. They can smell their time has come. From religious authoritarians to neo-fascist tech bros, radical ideologues are waiting in the wings. Every day they're gaining power, not because their ideas are so compelling, but because the alternatives feel so discredited. Let him try, people say of the next billionaire savior or would-be strongman. It can't be worse than this, right? But it can get worse, much worse. Here's the good news though. I promised that I'd structure this series as a classic three-part sermon. Act 1, misery, Act 2, redemption, and Act 3, thankfulness. The past, after all, is not just a graveyard of disasters. It's also a reservoir of hope. I have always been fascinated by those small groups of stubborn people who have changed the course of history. Sometimes for the worse, think of the Bolsheviks, but also gloriously for the better. Florence Nightingale and the nurses who pioneered evidence-based medicine. Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes who won the vote for women. Norman Borlaug and the inventors whose green revolution saved millions from famine. What all these people had in common was a clear vision, a scalable strategy, and the unflagging persistence to pursue their goals. In the immortal words of Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I know that many historians are skeptical of this view. They prefer to focus on the deep underlying forces of history, geography, demography, technology, and to such scholars, individuals aren't very important. The so-called great men theory of history, they argue, is to our craft what bloodletting is to medical science. The immorality and unseriousness of today's elites are, they think, the mere symptoms of deeper forces. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there is real power in this analysis. And yet I have two problems with it. First, it leaves little room for contingency, for the way history can suddenly veer in unexpected directions. Second, it denies our agency. Sure, the 19th century obsession with great men has rightly been dismissed as naive, elitist, and sexist. But it's also hard to deny that certain individuals, Lenin for one, did extraordinary harm. And if that is true, then perhaps the reverse could also be true. That a handful of men and women can bend the arc of history towards justice. A few years ago, I embarked upon a study of such people, of the great moral pioneers of the past. And before long, I found myself gripped by an unexpected feeling that I can only describe as moral envy. By then, I had spent about a decade of my career in the pundits industry, writing books and articles, giving talks, posting tweets, always hoping that someone else would do the actual work of making this world a better place. Meanwhile, I was on the sidelines, watching, commentating, and the more I read, the more jealous I became. The memoirs of these abolitionists, suffragettes, and humanitarians forced me to ask, what about my own life? What would my legacy be? As Theodore Roosevelt, the historian and president, once said, "It is not the critic who counts. History isn't changed by those without skin in the game, not by the cynics who explain why things will never work, or by the clever voices pointing out every flaw," something that I've seen especially often among journalists. Change comes from the people who risk embarrassment, who make mistakes, who get knocked down and stand up again. They are the ones who dare to commit themselves to a cause bigger than their own comfort. Sometimes they win, often they fail. But as Roosevelt reminded us, even in failure, they achieve more than those who never tried, who played it safe, who preferred irony over courage, and who never knew the taste of victory or the shame of defeat. Roosevelt himself, as a young man, devoured the stories of the heroes of ancient times and decided, this is the life I want. He made the conscious choice to live greatly. And today, I want to zoom in on a small group of thoughtful, committed people who made the same choice. We remember them as the kickstarters of the greatest movement for human rights this world has ever seen, the fight against the slave trade and slavery. And interestingly enough, this is a profoundly British story. As we all know, the UK built one of the most brutal slave empires. In Liverpool, even small shopkeepers eagerly bought shares in this monstrous trade. Yet Britain also became the driving force in banishing the slave trade from the face of the earth. And this paradox holds a vital lesson. Abolition is not just a chapter of history, it's also a reminder of what ambitious idealists can achieve. At a moment when Britain is losing confidence, slipping into decline, and drowning in nostalgia, it is worth remembering that its proudest achievement was not conquest or wealth or empire. It was the courage to abolish one of the darkest institutions in human history. Let me start with some basic facts about British abolitionism. The most important thing to understand is how weird this movement was, how utterly unlikely. In retrospect, it seemed to have come out of nowhere. No one had ever witnessed anything like it. In the summer of 1787, it spread up and down the country like wildfire. It was all over the newspapers, and in the coffee houses there was talk of little else. If you study the histories of all nations, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville later wrote, I doubt you would find anything so extraordinary or brilliant. Its masterminds were 12 men with black hats. On May 22 of that year, they had gathered in a small print shop at No. 2 George Yard in the heart of London. There, among the inkwells and piles of paper, they started the first and perhaps most influential human rights campaign ever. The 12's mission seemed as simple as it did impossible: to eradicate the greatest evil of their time. In a country where less than 3% of the population and not a single woman could vote, they launched a movement that would mobilize millions to overthrow one of the oldest economic systems. It was the first great political movement for the rights of others. In all of human experience, observes the great historian Adam Hochschild, there was no precedent for such a campaign. It's tempting to see the official abolition of legal slavery as the inevitable consequence of progress. That it would have disappeared anyway in a world of cars and computers, just as the stagecoach and the carrier pigeon faded from our lives. Yet historians tell us a different story. Dig deeper and you realize just how unlikely abolition was. A historical accident, one prominent scholar has called it. A contingent event that might just as easily never have occurred. In other European countries, there was hardly an abolitionist movement. The definitive history of abolition in Portugal is tellingly titled "The Sounds of Silence." In Spain, slavery barely registered as an issue. The French Anti-Slavery Society had only 141 members in the late 18th century and folded after 5 years. 50 years later, the Dutch equivalent struggled to persuade its members to even show up at meetings. Or, as one British abolitionist wrote about my beautiful home country, "This is a cold and dead place." And in the United States, the land of the free, well, the only party that opposed slavery, the Liberty Party, failed to win a single majority in any district. Even in 1860, the leading anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, had only 3,000 subscribers. The hard truth is that abolitionist was a term of abuse. A campaigner for the future president, Abraham Lincoln, once complained he was branded impudent, foppish, immature, and worst of all, an abolitionist. It was even worse than being a vegan today. Small wonder that most European and American abolitionists achieved so little. Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands banned the slave trade only reluctantly and only under British pressure, and that pressure was overwhelming. The Royal Navy launched a massive campaign against the slave trade, which would go down in history as the blockade of Africa. It has been described as the most expensive international moral effort in modern history. 2,000 slave ships were seized and 200,000 enslaved people freed. Researchers have estimated that direct British efforts brought about the eradication of 80% of the global slave trade. And this has led historians to a mind-bending conclusion. Without the success of the British movement, it could have taken significantly longer for slavery to be outlawed. Or it might never have happened at all. Had history taken a different turn, legal slavery might still be widespread. The print shop at number 2 George Yard is long gone. I visited the place recently, and on the spot where history was made, I found an ugly office block housing a private equity firm. That's the kind of place where our so-called best and brightest end up today. In my first Reith lecture, I talked about that waste of talent. The biggest problem in the world today isn't climate change, future pandemics, or democratic collapse. It's that far too many brilliant minds are working on everything but those problems. Yet, it doesn't have to be this way. The reason I became so obsessed with British abolitionism is that it offers an example of a different kind of ambition, a moral ambition. Its young leaders were just as ambitious as many Oxford and Cambridge graduates today, but somehow their ambition was channeled in a different direction. To understand how this happened, we have to take a closer look at the founders of the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Interestingly enough, 10 out of 12 were entrepreneurs. While French abolitionism was led by writers and intellectuals, the British movement was powered by merchants and businessmen. These were people who had built and scaled their own companies. And yes, some had grown quite wealthy in the process. But that's not why we remember them today. We remember them because they used their privilege to change the course of history. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with William Wilberforce, who actually wasn't one of the founders, but later got most of the credit for taking down the slave trade. Wilberforce was a curious case. As a student, he had spent his days gambling and drinking, and at 20 he thought it might be fun to stand for Parliament and used the inheritance from his grandfather to bribe enough people to vote for him. This was fairly standard procedure at the time. But at the age of 25, he decided to take a year off from politics to go touring around Europe, which was all the rage among rich kids, even back then. And in the fall of 1785, he saw the light. While hiking in the Swiss Alps, Wilberforce made the momentous decision to leave his sinful existence behind and dedicate his life to the Lord. He joined a new movement of Christians, the evangelicals, who were generally despised by the British elite as irritating do-gooders. From that day on, Wilberforce would only bend his mind to lofty matters. And what could be loftier than fighting slavery? There were those who doubted his motives and said that he cared more about his own soul than about the suffering of the enslaved. But what matters is that Wilberforce did devote his career to fighting the slave trade. Less well known, but more important, was another Cambridge graduate named Thomas Clarkson. He was the youngest of the founders of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. As a student, Clarkson had participated in an essay contest, which was the main way to make a name for yourself back then, an age without TikTok. Students had to write a dissertation in Latin addressing a simple question: is it permissible to enslave others against their will? At the time, Clarkson was 25 and studying to become a priest in the Church of England. I had no motive but that which other young men in the university had on such occasions, he later wrote, namely, the wish of obtaining literary honor. And sure enough, his essay won first prize. But after the prize ceremony in Cambridge, he couldn't get the subject out of his head. There's this famous moment in his memoirs about when he was on the way back to London and got down off his horse. He was brooding and trying to find some error in his reasoning. But the longer he thought, the more the truth dawned on him. As the village of Wade's Mill came into view, Clarkson sat down by the side of the road, sunk in despair. Here the thought occurred to me, he later wrote, that if the contents of the essay were true, it was time that some person should see these calamities to the end. Suddenly, Clarkson could see himself as the hero who would take down the slave trade. A few weeks later, at a dinner with a few other abolitionists, he rose and solemnly spoke the words, "I am ready to devote myself to the cause." Now, this may sound a tad performative. And yes, reading Clarkson's memoirs today, you can't help rolling your eyes sometimes. But in the real world, actions outweigh intentions, and what matters is that the ambitious student kept his word. Call it virtue signaling, if you like. But it was real virtue. For the rest of his life, 61 years, Clarkson continued to fight slavery. He traveled 35,000 miles across the United Kingdom on horseback, often at night, and set up hundreds of local committees and recruited thousands of supporters. He even went into the belly of the beast, Liverpool. He was almost murdered by slave traders who tried to push him off a pier. Christopher Leslie Brown, one of the foremost experts on British abolitionism, was once asked who we should see as the most consequential individual in the history of anti-slavery. Brown answered that at the start of his career, he was determined not to give too much attention to those individual heroes. He wanted to focus on the structural causes. But the more time Brown spent in the archives, the more he realized that some individuals had outsized influence. Would the slave trade have been abolished without Wilberforce? Probably. Some historians even think that a savvier politician could have pushed abolition through Parliament faster. But Thomas Clarkson? Could it have happened without him? Another Clarkson is unimaginable, says his biographer. Clarkson brought the committee together in 1787 at a crucial moment. He devoted his whole life to the struggle. What St. Paul was to Christianity, that's what Thomas Clarkson was for abolitionism. A contemporary described him as a moral steam engine and a giant with one idea. There's one crucial fact about British abolitionism that I haven't mentioned yet. Its timing was everything. Just like Russia in 1917, and just like the world today, Britain was at a crossroads. The late 18th century was also an age of decadence and decline. The political center was under extraordinary pressure, the same pressure that across the Channel would soon fuel the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and the beheading of a king. People were sick of their leaders. Parliament reeked of gin, and MPs routinely slurred their speeches. The king's son, the future George IV, was a notorious drunk and gambler and an incredible jerk, even by royal standards. One of his top aides wrote after his death, "A more contemptible, cowardly, selfish, unfeeling dog does not exist." The moral rot had spread beyond the palace and Parliament. London had become the sex capital of the world, with as many as 1 in 5 women forced into prostitution. Executions were staged as public spectacles, while animals were routinely beaten and tortured in the streets. The English nation oversteps all others in immorality, a German visitor observed, and the abuses which come to light through addiction to debauchery are unbelievable. In short, virtue was not in vogue. And in exactly that decaying culture, a movement for moral renewal was born. The abolitionists were a small band of renegades, Quakers and evangelicals who didn't just take on the slave trade. They set out to spark a wider moral revolution. Wilberforce, for example, wouldn't have described his life's mission as fighting slavery. For him, abolitionism was part of something bigger, the attempt to make goodness fashionable. But how do you bring about a cultural revolution like that? Their answer was simple: by practicing what you preach, by pledging yourself to a worthy cause. Remember, people don't do good things because they're good people. They become good people by doing good things, even when they may initially act out of vanity. The latter is only human nature. We all crave recognition. Most of us want to be seen and admired. But in our society today, we admire the wrong things and the wrong people. What the British abolitionists taught me is that it is possible to rewrite a nation's honor code, to make a different kind of ambition go viral, to make goodness contagious. My original plan was to spend 5 years writing a hefty tome about history's great moral pioneers. But after finishing the first part on the British abolitionists, I shelved the project. The moral envy had become too strong. I no longer wanted to just write about the people in the arena. I wanted to join them. So in late 2023, I co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition. We like to think of ourselves as the Robin Hoods of talent, taking the best and brightest out of their boring corporate jobs and redirecting them to the great causes of our time. At the heart of our work lies a simple belief that small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. What we need today is not just bottom-up resistance. We also need a new elite, not of birth, wealth, or silly credentials, but of massive positive impact. I'm talking about a skin in the game elite, about people who use what they have, their human, financial, or cultural capital, to make a huge difference. Our goal should be to make future historians proud. This is not about left versus right. It's about seriousness versus laziness, determination versus apathy, good versus evil. If we want to preserve the post-war democratic order, we have to prove that our way works. That we're not just a bunch of whiners and NIMBYs who never get anything done. We have to show that liberal democracy can deliver and that we're willing to fight for it. In 1917, most Russians thought the future was already written. They assumed nothing good could come out of politics anymore, that history was a rigged game where every new set of rulers was as bad as the last. That cynicism proved fatal. It opened the door to a tyrant who promised salvation and delivered catastrophe. But what 1917 also shows us is that in moments of crisis, the world is unusually malleable. And that's why moments like this are so dangerous and so full of possibility. The iron of history is softest when the center is weakest. This is where we are today. Our own age of disillusionment could become the prelude to a new authoritarian era. Or it could be remembered as the moment when a new kind of ambition took hold, a moral ambition, like the abolitionists once embodied. The same apathy that gave Lenin his opening could just as well have given someone like Clarkson or Wilberforce theirs. In 1785, a young man on horseback pulled over to the side of the road near the village of Wade's Mill and decided to change history. Today could be our Wade's Mill moment. Thank you.